Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us this morning for our first meeting of this book club. We're gonna that's what I'm gonna call it. We're spending a little bit of time this morning. We're gonna be talking about Clay's Quilt by Silas House. We're excited that you're going to be here with us and joining us. I think we have a few more people who'll be coming with us throughout the morning and jumping on here. But we're excited that you're here with us as we talk a little bit about this book and learn from each other, and see where we go from here. So I should start by saying that I am not an expert in Appalachian literature or Silas House or any of that, but I know somebody who is, and that's Silas House. And so he's going to be here in just a few weeks to join us on our last book study, to answer questions and to talk about this book and kind of the history of Appalachian literature and put a lot of this into context. And as we talk about it, I'm sure that we're going to have lots of questions too as we go through this. So we'll talk together, and then we'll talk with him a little bit later in this series. But I'm excited you all are here this morning. So welcome. We are going to be meeting for this week and then 3 weeks beyond here. We're going to meet every Thursday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern time, 9 a.m. Central, for about an hour. And we're just going to talk about the different components of this particular book. And then from there, we will move into kind of our next steps. So this week and the next 2 weeks, it'll be just us. We're going to chat about the books. We have some talking points and some discussion, but really, I want you all to be fully engaged in this. I mean, this is about all of us learning together. It's not about any one person kind of directing this or telling you where we're going or what's going to happen, but it's really all of us together. And so that's kind of what I hope will happen over the next few weeks. And then again, as I said, on that last Thursday, which is 4 weeks from now, 3 weeks from now, I guess, Silas House himself will be joining us here. And so as we start our conversation, one of the things I want us to do, getting right into this, is I want you guys to take notes and to write down questions, thoughts that you have, things that you want to talk to Silas about. When he comes on here, he'll give us a little bit of information, but really it's going to be a conversation with him where we can talk about what's going on. And so that's going to be largely dependent on you all. So we hope that you will share information with us as we go and make sure that you have questions ready for Silas when he joins us here a little bit later. So that's kind of what we're going to do and kind of how we're going to flow these meetings a little bit. I will share that kind of the purpose. Some folks have said, well, why are we looking at this particular book? And that's a great question. We could have looked at any number of books. There's a lot of books that relate around Appalachian culture and kind of where and have meaning, I think, that could have or draw meaning for a lot of us and a lot of our students. But this is just a book that we knew that we wanted to invite Silas to come and talk with us, so we can learn from him. And so we went right to the source and we said, Silas, what do you think is the best book we could use to start off the series, to start talking about kind of how we can move forward? And this was his recommendation from that. So we're really excited about that too. And the purpose of why we've kind of selected this genre of Appalachian literature is in hopes that we can integrate some more novels, some more great literature into our classes, that we can elevate kind of some of the conversations that we're having across the state about what it means to be experienced and understanding kind of the depths of this literature and interpreting literature and drawing meaning from literature in your own life. And so we wanted to integrate this. And I think it also has some comparisons and some logical things that we can pull into the experiences of our own students. And so that's what we're hoping to do throughout this process. So that's kind of where we're going to start and kind of what we hope to accomplish through this process. At the end, we know that you may not use this particular book, but we hope that you will be open to using some expanded literature in our courses that we offer across our programs, and getting our students involved in kind of where we are and kind of the learning that we hope to take place. So that's kind of where we are. We have a guest with us this morning, David Sullivan. Hey, David, out there. David is in the Mercer County Day Treatment Program in Mercer County. Has done a wonderful job over there with his English and language arts students, and has integrated a lot of Silas House's books and other books and novels that he's integrated. So I'm going to ask, actually, David, if you would tell us a little bit to kind of start off our conversation this morning about the literature you use, how you integrate that into your classroom, kind of what your students get from that. If you would just take a few minutes, as long as you want, but just, to talk a little bit about what it is you do in your class, I think we'd all appreciate that.
Sure. Well, thanks for inviting me on. First of all, I love this is a little bit out of the realm of the kind of fiction that we normally do read. We read a lot of apocalyptic fiction, a lot of Stephen King, Hugh Howley, but I will tell you, I think this is probably the best choice for this type of literature. And my class really does. We get into this book every year, and the kids really like it because there's so many things that you can tie into. And I'll tell you that I reread the book just a couple of days ago, just to sort of make sure that I was ready for the study, because you always pick up different things. But first and foremost, this book, there's about 4 areas that we really sort of connect. Lessons on Poverty. This is an amazing book. Your kids will immediately, no matter what their backgrounds are, they will recognize the effects of poverty and how that sort of interacts. So there's lots of great lessons that we do that. That's number 1. Number 2, the drug use. They mention pot and Xanax and cocaine and alcohol and pills. All that, many of your kids will immediately recognize, if not in their homes and relatives' homes. So it's a great lesson there. It's a great tie-in. We do a lot of talking about that. Geography. This is probably the best lesson that we use. We do a lesson on what's real and what's not. They'll mention the Daniel Boone Parkway. They'll talk about Laurel County. They'll talk about the Cumberland Gap. And then every once in a while, Silas will throw in a totally fictional county. And so we do what's real and what's not, and our kids will learn really quickly. We do prizes and games for when they can spot what's real and what's not. And it's really interesting because they'll become very familiar with that part of Kentucky and West Virginia, and make the connections there, because a lot of them will have family from there or maybe have traveled to there. So we do that. And then the last thing, this is really my favorite thing for the book, is music. This book, to me, first and foremost, is about music. It's music in almost every chapter. And I wrote a list yesterday of all the mentions, and I'll just mention them real quickly because they're so amazing. But Silas House has some of the best, he implanted some of the best singers, songwriters, not only from Kentucky, but from around here. Alison Krauss, Loretta Lynn, Neil Young, CCR, Leonard Skinner, Janis Joplin, Osborne Brothers, Tom Petty, Bob Dylan, Bill Monroe, Charlie Daniels, Steve Earle, and then lots of classical and gospel music. So what we do is we go through that book and we sample from all of those. Of course, a lot of those are, a lot of our favorite. And then we let the kids make their own sample playlist. And they love that. That's like a big connection for them because, a lot of them love music. Now, their playlists are, not what I would listen to necessarily, but they love doing their own playlist. And so we compare Silas's music, which is in almost every chapter. He will have music in there, and we get to sample a lot of Appalachian music. And of course, if anybody loves Tyler Childers, he's not in the book, but his music to me resonate. It should be, because his music is Clay's Quilt type of music. So our kids really like that. So we take about 4 areas and really do a deep dive into that. And this really becomes one of their favorite books of the year that we read.
Well, Tyler Childers did write the foreword in the book that we provided to everybody. So
right.
Not in the book, but he certainly is in the book in that context. I think you're absolutely right. In fact, one of the things that we were talking about this is kind of the importance of music in this book. And you hit it right on the nail on the head. There's so many mentions of some great music that's happening. And we started off our session today. If you got here a little bit early, about 10 minutes before we started playing that music. So
God, missed that.
we played 3 of the songs that he talked about in the first 7 chapters. So Harper Valley PTA, which took me back to when I was a kid, and I loved that song. The imagery that it brought out and kind of what it represented for me personally, it really took me back as well. So I think you're absolutely right. The music does play such a critical part of this, and we're going to talk about kind of the importance of music in this book as we go through it. But you hit it right on the head with that. So thank you for sharing with us how you use this in your class, and kind of where we go from here. And that's what we hope to spur with this. Is we hope that other folks will start talking about and thinking about how do we use these novels and this fiction and Appalachian literature and others to really get our students engaged in a way that maybe they haven't been engaged in the past, to get that really depth of engagement that we really want. So thank you for that. It's a great example, and I think the inspiration for where we started with this. I'll share with you all that maybe a year ago, it might have even been a little bit longer than that. We were visiting David's program, the Mercer County Day Treatment, and meeting with his students in his class. And he does, or has done prior to the pandemic at least, a podcast that his students organize and run in his program. And so I was lucky enough to be a guest on that podcast along with some other folks. And we started having a conversation about who we would love to see on this podcast that his students do. And if you haven't seen it, you guys need to go check it out. They do such a fantastic job of interviewing folks. They really do the research. The students lead the interviews. They do the production part. They do all of it. It's really, I think, a very engaging way to get students involved in learning. And so part of that conversation was Silas House. And that's kind of where we landed with Silas. It was our dream at that time to bring Silas in with his students and with our other students across the state to really talk about kind of his life and his work and where that led us. So that's kind of where this all started from. So thank you, David, for and Javier, who's out there, I think, as well. Thank you guys for the inspiration for this session and for moving us forward. So we appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Guys, as we go into this, what I'm hoping is that you all will chat with us. I mean, I'll tell you, I told you at the beginning, I'm not the expert in this. I think we have a lot of talented folks on this call, and I know that you probably have thoughts about the book as well. So I'm just going to kind of start us out, ask a question, and then I'd love to hear from you all, and let's just have a conversation. And then we may break down into a little bit of a smaller group in a few minutes, just to pull us into some small group discussion around some particular questions that you may want to delve into a little more in a little more detail. So, but kind of the first thing that we talked about, and it's something that David touched on already, are the themes that have emerged from this book. And so David gave us, I think, 4 really great starters, and quite frankly, new ones for me, because I think you're right that every time we read this, every time we look at it, people get different things from it. I love that you started out with the theme of like the effects of poverty and what that looks like. I think from my perspective, maybe, and I mean, growing up in the areas that he talks about in the book and experiencing kind of a lot of the things that he talks about, the poverty, all of that it didn't seem like an emerging theme to me because it was just so normal that to me, that it didn't really stick out of like, oh, that's an entire theme in this book. And you're absolutely right, it is. But depending on your perspective of where you're coming from with this, it may not be as clear or hit you in the face as much as it does for somebody else. But you also talked about the use of drugs within the book, the geography of the book. I love the way you integrated the use of geography and talking about what's real and what's not, of learning about Kentucky and kind of the topography and kind of where we are and what it looks like. I think we probably all conjured up an image in our head of what he was talking about when he was describing where he was. And so for me personally, I'll just share with you guys that So my just a little background that's probably irrelevant, but this is just a conversation, so I'll just share. Um, when I was growing up, my mom is actually one of the Hurricane Creek mining disaster widows. So I don't know if you guys know about the Hurricane Creek mining disaster. It happened in 1970 on, I think it was New Year's Eve on that day, and it was at the time in the country's history, it was the worst mining disaster that has ever taken place in the country. And so her first husband was a coal miner there and was killed in that coal mine during that New Year's Eve, just shortly after Christmas. And so she had my two older half brothers who were twins. They were 3 years old at the time. And so they suddenly found themselves without a dad. She was a widow at a very young age. And I recently visited the Hurricane Creek mining disaster monument, the memorial that is built up at the site of that mine. And so as I'm reading this book, that is exactly the image that came to mind. And I remember driving down from that mining disaster memorial where all of those people died in that tragedy, driving down that winding hill that came from the top of that mountain and hitting out onto the four-way, which is what they call the Daniel Boone Parkway there. And that's over in the Hazard Harlan area, just kind of a visual. So that's immediately where my mind went in the imagery of what he was painting in this book. And I know many of you probably had a similar image or you brought that home as well. So that idea of geography, of learning kind of where we are in Kentucky and the imagery that comes with that, I think is really important as well. And music that we just talked about as the other theme. But I'm interested in hearing from other folks kind of what other themes you thought emerged. What stuck out to you and kind of what came to life for you in this book. So I'll open the floor. I'd love to hear from some folks.
I'll get started. I'm from Eastern Kentucky as well. And I moved to Illinois when I was 21 years old. And when I would talk about my friends using their nicknames in Illinois, people thought I was crazy. And so one thing that really stuck out was, cake and just some of the nicknames that they use within this book. I have images in my head of what these people look like based on my own friends with very odd nicknames. And so just within the first, and I started last night and I'm almost finished because I couldn't put the book down. The nicknames and then just when you were talking about music, like certain songs, and I picture now these characters and my friends like intermixing with the music. It's just, it hits home in many different ways, but the nicknames of these folks really stood out to me.
Thank you for that. I agree with that as well. And the names kind of do conjure up an image of what you think they look like. And I was just talking to some folks earlier about Easter, who's a prominent character in the book, who before we got kind of a description of her, I had a completely different image of what she looked like and what she kind of presented until we got to a point. And that was based on kind of maybe my own experience of growing up and connecting kind of what I thought my imagery around her character looked like. And it was very different, I think, than what came out later in the book. So I agree with that 100%. Other folks?
And just to talk about the nicknames, like she was talking about, the two people later on in the book, you found out that Easter and Clay's mom were named after actual flowers. So I thought that was interesting about the nicknames too. But I was kind of thinking about the family and the loyalty and kind of living in the holler all by themselves, just that sense of community that it built too. I thought that was a really good theme.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think we all saw one of the strongest themes, not just in this book, but throughout all of Silas's work, is the importance of family, kind of that connection to family. I think that's a very Appalachian cultural connection that is prominent in this book and certainly in his others as well. So thanks, Amanda, for that. You're absolutely right. I think that plays a prominent role. And we're going to talk, I think, in our smaller groups a little bit more about the importance of that family connection.
Ronnie, I like to piggyback on those guys a little bit. Sarah, I see you in Frankfurt. Nice to see you. She was my mentor. So I lived in Chicago for about a year and a half, and one of my favorite tours is to go up on the top of the Sears Tower, and then the tour guide would kind of talk about the concentric communities throughout the Chicago area. So all the different 58 different nationality concentric communities. And it reminded me, of that. Like when you think about a quilt, it truly is a quilt. Every time, you go home after a long day's work back to the Little Italy or Chinatown or whatever, or Hazard or wherever you are, in Appalachia, it's the same thing. It's a safety. And especially when you think about immigration over the mountains by the Irish and the Scottish, and how that worked, and those, the need to be tight and take care of each other. It's amazing to me. I think if you went there now, you'd still find a lot of the concentric communities embedded in hollers and different places. But it's also interesting how a lot of those connections and that tightness led to the, Hatfields and McCoys and all those different kind of stuff as well.
Jeremy, I think you're right. And that's one of the, that's one of the things that I think really emerged for me is as we talk about the importance of family, that's so evident in this book. And we relate kind of our own experiences in Appalachia and this community and this larger community that we're in, and the close knitness of those communities, and how in this book, I mean, it seems a very positive kind of, flowery kind of experience. Everything seems very, very good. But then I have to contrast that with when we have those same kinds of connections, like those same communities that are not healthy, that lead to a lot of trouble and turmoil. And I think about the connection to our students in this book. And I'll just share with you all, I mean, personal information. I just talk and you guys cut me off or tune me out if you want to, but you all know that I adopted a little girl years ago. And now she's almost 8. She'll be 8 in just about 2 months. And she's amazing. And I mean, she's fantastic. And she did not know her birth mother or birth father. She did not know her biological parents at all. And it is amazing to me as an adoptive parent of somebody, she's never had interaction with them, and she still talks about them. She still, even the other day we were out for a walk and, we were talking about something crazy. And she said, if the world ever ended, I would save you, Daddy. And I would also save my mom and dad. And I said, well, I said, okay. I said, but that's, I'm your dad. And she's like, no, my mom and dad, which is a hard conversation for us to continually have. And we have that conversation a lot, but it talks about and really illustrates for me on a personal level, the connection that folks have to that idea of family, even when it's not that positive environment that we all wish that it was. And so I connect that to our kids we have so many kids in our system who come into a safe, nurturing environment, who are provided with all of the things that they need theoretically. I mean, it's, and what that looks like. But at the end of the day, like when they turn 18 or they age out of the system or whatever, I mean, so many talk about, I just want to get back home. I'm going to move back in with my mom. I'm going to move in with my dad, back into the same kind of information or situation that led to their circumstances, oftentimes of them being removed from that environment and placed somewhere else. And so that I really think about that throughout this too, the connection of place and connection of family and how that impacts our kids.
Ronnie, I think that kind of sheds light though about the power of codependency. And it's kind of like, I look at codependency almost like it's an implicit bias that we didn't know we had. And while it is negative, they still feel loved in here. even if it's painful to do it. It's a weird duplicity. And one of the things I used to do in a drug and alcohol program I ran early in my career was teach kids about signs and symptoms of what codependency actually is, because most people don't understand. And the aha moments that would come later as the kids would think through it was powerful. And I think that would probably be a common, very, very common thing across most of our programs, is not even, I think you have to identify what it is exactly, and how it's like, the crab's pulling you back in the pot sometimes, and that whole why try thing.
I feel like this is one of those learning opportunities that this book would provide a class, is to have those conversations around this in a way that I think is disarming in a lot of the ways that we kind of, people get so defensive about family very quickly. I don't, y'all can have mine, but other people do. And so I think this kind of introduces that in a way that makes it, or could make it very acceptable to have those kinds of conversations about connection to family and place and what that looks like. And how that can be a very positive experience for some people and also not a very positive experience for others as well.
I was going to say that brought up two different things I remembered. When Dreama goes to get married at a very young age, just a year after high school, that's very common. That was very common when I left high school. That's very common even in this, my building now. These girls are wanting to, and she says it in here, it wasn't because her father, is drinking and partying, but it's almost like they're escaping and they want something better. And then we also see here that our girls are having babies. I saw this a lot when I was doing the residential treatment with young ladies. They want to have their own families because they want somebody to love them unconditionally, because they didn't have that connection growing up. And so I don't want to spoil in case some of you aren't as far, but just with Dreama's current situation, it rings true with, I saw one of my former students yesterday. She is a year clean, her child back, but she has gone through some of it, like, I'm going to get pregnant. This baby is mine. It is mine to love me. And you can't change that mindset. You have to accept and find a way to support it. And I feel like that's what Clay's doing with Dreama in this book, to the point where I'm at right now. But it so relates to my girls.
Yeah.
I actually thought of Roy Chapman while I was reading this, the beginning of it, especially when they're referring to hills and hollers and creeks and things like that. I didn't realize he was from Eastern Kentucky until he came to visit one time, and he was over here, and he realized I had a student from Eastern Kentucky from the same county he was from. So he goes, where is so-and-so? And I said, there. He goes, hey, are you from such and such? He's like, yeah. He says, well, which holler are you from? And I'm like, what the heck? And so the kid said, he goes, were you on the first creek, the second creek, or the third creek back? And the kid was like, the second? He goes, well, I'm from the third creek back. And the kid was like, oh, wow. He knew exactly what he was talking about. So just I don't know. It's not just about how they call things and things like that, but it's just, I don't know the word I'm looking for, but it was just even though they weren't related, they had almost like a bond there of being from that area, and knew he didn't have to give proper names of things and knew exactly where they were talking about and stuff. It's like two turns past the drive-in on the right, people, regional dialect and things like that. It was just that I thought about that when I was reading it, thought about him specifically and reading it.
Thanks, Justin. I think you touched on something that Tyler Childers talked about in his foreword for the book. And I think he was in Amsterdam or Austria somewhere, I forget. And he was kind of at a flea market, I think, if I'm remembering this correctly, and he just heard somebody else talking. And he immediately recognized the accent as being, somebody from where he's from, kind of thing. And so he immediately connected, and they immediately had kind of a kinship and a relationship that pulled them together just based on that dialect and where they're from. And so I think that really does, it's very powerful. And that's not something that is just, relevant to Eastern Kentucky. As folks in the comment section, if you guys are reading those, I mean, these are universal things that span these themes all across not just Kentucky, but I think the country as well. And probably not just our country, probably others as well, when they're, of how people are together. And so I think that, that theme of that family and that comes out through this, and the loyalty to family and all of that is one of those emerging themes that I think comes out of this book that we can use in our classes. So I want to make sure that you guys captured that as you're thinking about how do we use this with our students and what does that look like. Other folks who might have other themes that they saw emerging through this?
It wasn't really a theme, but he made you be there, especially being from Eastern Kentucky. You felt like you had lived his book. And he so much, with all the smells and the creaks and the sounds, and as he goes into detail, you can place yourself there very easily.
It is. We were talking a little bit earlier before this. It's a very cleaned up, idealistic, kind of idealized version of kind of the Appalachian experience in a lot of ways, because it's very, very beautiful. I mean, even the descriptions of some of the things that in my mind, of my pulling from my own experience of, like, for example, driving up Butcher Holler, where Loretta Lynn, I don't know if you guys have been to Loretta Lynn's homestead in Eastern Kentucky at Butcher Holler, that she wrote her famous song about coal miner's daughter. But I visited there a couple of times and recently took my daughter there, and driving into that holler and looking at kind of the community there and what was once a very thriving coal community. And you can tell, like, it has like a general store. It has like all these kind of exactly kind of what the book is picturing. There's mountains on both sides with these houses set up at the foothills of the mountain. And if you stood on the porch, you could see the top of both mountains from both sides, and kind of that driving up. But this seems like a very idealized version of that. I mean, it's like he sees through his experience only the beauty that's there. And I think that is actually another great theme that we can relate to our students and kind of their experiences before they became into our programs or whatever, that a lot of times, and we do this too, we only remember the beauty. A lot of times we forget, and with time, we forget the wrongs that have happened. We forget the heartache and the difficulties and some of those things. And we remember kind of an idealized version of what life was like. And I even think of that, and probably most of us do too, when you think back to your childhood. A lot of us think about the really good things that happen and the fun things that happen. And we forget all of those really desperate times and even I once a few years ago wrote a story for my alma mater, Berea College I went to, and where Silas works, by the way. And it was about my love of government cheese. And, we got government cheese growing up. My memory is that I loved government cheese. It was like Christmas every month,
Best grilled cheeses ever.
Yeah, the best
It
grilled
is.
cheese. You can cut it.
What's in the box?
It's like this beautiful kind of memory for me. And I forget all of the trauma around that of what created a need for me to have government cheese. It's kind of like that. I remember that beautiful memory of that. And so I think a lot of our students also kind of go through that same kind of thing, and we do too. And so I think that's a good learning opportunity as well. Some of those other visions, I think Katie over in the comments said it, he made coal dust sound romantic. And my dad was a coal miner and later a coal truck driver. And I remember all of those very early. He passed when I was 6 years old, but he was, he'd come home covered in in that coal dust, and it was not romantic, or like at the time it was, it was just everywhere. But you're right, in this book, I mean, it just made you think about how beautiful it was, and his face covered in kind of the descriptions of his face with those emerald green eyes, kind of what I pictured them kind of shining out from that blanket of coal dust, and kind of all of the beauty within kind of that darkness. So anyway,
And he was so explicit about even talking about looking like you've got eyeliner on. And that is what happens, because I come from a lot of coal miners in my family. And no matter if you wash and take a bath, you'll still have that line on your eye if you're not very careful. And he made that. I mean, he was so explicit in explaining that when he was giving his description. I thought, yeah, he's seen some coal miners.
Yeah. I think Katie, I'll share with Katie what you said when you first read it, is it made you want to drink a beer in the shower.
I think you're talking about, how areas that we grow up, we look back on things fondly, and we don't realize either how good or how bad it was because we were living in the moment. Even now, when my wife, she does preschool home visits and stuff, and the kids are so excited to show them their room and stuff, and she's just heartbroken at the conditions, and the kids don't realize that it's bad because that's what they know. That's all that the rooms ever looked like, all that their house ever looked like, and she just gets back in the car and cries and has her breakdown, and then, but still, we remember those things fondly because that was our life. That's what we know. And stuff, and whether we go other places, we realize we're in awestruck of things that people are just walking by monuments or historic buildings and don't think anything about it. That's just always been there. It's what we know, and stuff. So I just thought that was, it's a good point that you brought up about, how he's painting that picture of it. You haven't really heard of any of the bad stuff yet. Yes, apparently there was an accident at the beginning that took his mom's life, but it's their day-to-day life, and he's painting a real nice picture of it. But that's what you know. And I've seen that with the kids that I've talked to here, and then hear my wife's stories as well of how proud her little 3, 4, and 5-year-olds are their house and her bedroom, and she's just heartbroken of the conditions that they're living in and stuff.
Even that terrible tragedy at the beginning of the book was beautiful. I mean, he talked about the beauty of the mountains covered in the snow, and that they stopped at the top and looked out. I mean, even in that tragic moment, he recalled the beauty of what happened. And I think context is important, Justin. And one of the things that, you guys know a lot of my life story, and many of you probably have very similar, but I grew up in some pretty severe poverty, and like many of you did as well. And I didn't really know that's what it was at the time, because in our community, everybody was about the same. I mean, it was like, that there was no like comparison to so-and-so who had more. In my holler that I grew up in on this stretch, I mean, everybody was pretty much the same. And I'll just, one of the funniest things that happened to me, and this is, it's really weird, is when I went to college, we had an opening convocation. You guys probably do too. I remember this clear as day. I went with all my new favorite best friends I had just met an hour before, and we were all sitting together at this opening convocation in this beautiful historic building on campus. And a couple of things happened during that I still remember to this day. And that has been a long time ago, folks. I mean, 25 years ago, and I still remember it. One of the vice presidents got up and started talking, and he said 2 things. One was, look to your left and look to your right. One of these people won't be here at the end of the year. I remember him saying that distinctly, and I thought, even at the moment, how defeatist, that sounded. But the other thing that struck me, and that I laugh about now, is that he started talking about how we were all poor. And this was, keep in context, this was that long ago, but it was Berea. And if you're familiar with Berea College, they give full tuition scholarships to students who have limited economic abilities, but according to them, some sort of academic credential. So, I mean, I understand now that they accept students who are from a very low economic status, and that they give them that to help. But at the time, I really did not feel poor. And I remembered even looking around thinking, God, which one of them is poor? Which one, not fully understanding, even in that moment. I was 17 at the time when I went away to college, and thinking, what is he talking about? It's just, it's crazy to kind of put that in context. So it really is, even for our students, of that, understanding where you are and what your experience is in that moment. Might not, I mean, if you don't know any different than that, that's what you know. And so that context is exactly right. And what your wife experiences, Justin, when she goes out and visits with a student. So other thoughts about that particular topic or other themes that have emerged?
I totally heard and identify with every word of that. I actually still live in Jackson, Kentucky, and I've read the trilogy of House's books. It's probably been 10 years ago, but I'm so excited to share it with students this time. But I went to Alice Lloyd College, so it's kind of a sister, ideal. It's the mountains, version of.
Never passes.
Yes, yes. So I get the curvy, beautiful mountains. I understand all of that. I still live right in the middle of it, and but Silas's words and his description is the description of a heyday that I grew up in, that when coal miners had coal on their faces, it was a good thing because they made good money that day. And the discussion of living in poverty, I love to talk about the similarities with students, the similarities of urban poverty and mountain or rural poverty. There's a lot of similarities, and then there's a few differences of that community feeling in that holler. If there's a hungry kid on the holler, somebody on that holler is going to take care of it.
Yep. I think you're absolutely right. Is we have to remember the context of when this is written in the time frame too. I mean, this is, as best I can draw from this, we're looking at late 70s, right? Is that where you guys landed? Late 70s?
That's about where I put it.
Yeah. So Silas was born in 71, which, puts him this year at 50. So he's right in that kind of, this put him, I kind of took this story as kind of following his lifeline in there. So I'm looking at late 70s with that. So you're right. The heyday of kind of coal country and what that meant. Just another funny story I just to share, I've shared with our staff here, but I told you that my mom was one of the Hurricane Creek mine widows. And after that, her husband was a coal miner, and she later married my dad, who was also a coal miner. But at that time, they lost everything. I mean, that almost all of the wives stayed home with kids. They didn't work at the time. My mom didn't work. She had 2 3-year-olds. And I remember that she tells me this story about how all of these folks came in to raise money for them, and Loretta Lynn came in and did a fundraiser and a benefit concert for the widows of the Hurricane Creek mining disaster. She did it in Freedom Hall in Louisville. And they invited all of the widows and their families to come and sit on the front row of this concert. I should tell you all that my mom hates Loretta Lynn. Cannot stand her, and this is why. During that event, all of the widows were standing in the back behind the stage, and Loretta came out, or Loretti, whatever you want to call her. Loretta came out, and she was meeting all of them, and she got to my mom, and she stopped and looked my mom up and down and said, "Well, look at you, ain't you pretty? You don't look like you need anything." And my mom responded back to her and said, "Well, Loretti, we wasn't poor till our husbands was killed." She remembers distinctly that it was a heyday. I mean, they were not struggling. I mean, her husband was a miner, and they had good money then. And so they were able to have things. And so it was just so striking to her in the moment that she felt such judgment and such kind of lack of remorse or lack of, empathy from Loretta. And still to this day, if you ever ask her about her, she'll say, "I can't stand that woman." And that's why. But it was that heyday that Kathy's talking about exactly of kind of the coal mining industry back in those late 70s in Eastern Kentucky. I'm probably sharing way too much with y'all. Y'all are gonna know all my family secrets before this book study's over. Other thoughts that you guys have?
There was one thought, I'm sorry, I feel like I'm talking too much too. There were a couple sections in the book, and I have to remember the types of students I have now, and then some are more urban, but Clay talks about him and Cake, like it wasn't a big deal for them to sleep together, like after going out to the hilltop. And then there's the part where Cake takes his shirt off and he's laying on the porch and he tells Clay, like, join me. And in that section, I'm like, oh my goodness, what my kids at school, like we would have to have a stop conversation there and talk about that dynamic of family, because I can already in my mind, I was like, I already know which kids are going to say something and how they're going to misconstrue that. And then Clay's relationship with Dreama and how it was no big deal for him to just come into a room, and, you know, them to have the relationships are so deep that I don't know that some of my kids here would understand that connection without taking it to a different level. And so as I'm reading this, I'm thinking, okay, if I was reading this out loud or we were doing a book study, how do I help them understand that that's okay? Because some of them have a really hard time with that. I don't know. That was just something I was like, okay, so that's something that we're going to have to like plan through and, you know, talk about the appropriateness of, you know, relationships among family. And it doesn't always mean something's inbred, or I'm just thinking of the words that they would use. These are not my words, but as I'm saying, like, oh gosh, these are going to bring up other topics that we may have to touch on, just the close relationships. So.
Well, and I think he made it clear that it was they just slept together and had did that, and the innocence of that. I think he made a point to that, but I think you're exactly right that kids would automatically think, okay, what's really going on there between the two of them?
Not just kids. I don't know if you all have Googled this book, but there's like a whole threads on the internet about what is really going on with the relationship there. What is this? This is not just kid focused. I mean, it's really, I think you're right, Sarah, in that you have to have that conversation, but I think it's a great gateway to having that conversation.
Well, that, and then just remembering, you know, knowing the audience of who you're talking to, you may have victims of abuse, you know, within your group, and to make sure that I mean, there's just so many different pathways that conversation could take, especially with Clay and Dreama and some of the trauma that my students have just coming in, and, you know, realizing the innocence of it. That may be hard for a female or a male who have experienced trauma within their family.
Yeah.
Especially with all the alcohol and the many people that was coming into the house. That just opens the door a lot of times that something else is going on when you've got that many people coming in and you have a daughter or you have a son.
I mean, for someone who's a mandated reporter and you hear that and you hear the relationships, it would make you second guess, you know, not second guess, but you would have to sit and probe those kids if you heard those conversations in your office or in the classroom to find out what's truly going on. If dad's having, you know, his friends over all the time and sleeping everywhere, people sleeping in the hallway. I mean, those are like, is that a home that's fit for this child? But, you know.
That's from our perspective, like, right? So we put our glasses on of like our perspective of what's appropriate and what's not. But you notice Dreama, it was never any issue for Dreama. I mean, when she was ready for anybody to go home, she just told them to go home and they all left. You know, and it's a very different experience. Nick over in the comments, I don't know if you guys have seen that, but commenting over there, kind of the family and closeness, the bonding, exactly what Sarah's talking about. Very clear in his experience. He grew up in California, moved here to Huntington, West Virginia in this area just 15 years ago, I think is somewhere in there. And kind of the differences between the culture of family closeness and what that looks like between this region and kind of where he grew up. I think that's the theme, Sarah, that you're talking about as well.
I just wanted to add that, you know, family is a a very common theme within Appalachian literature, and the closeness, and why there's such a community. They feel like a close community. It's because a lot of times when people leave Appalachia, there's the stigma attached to it that, of ignorance, and you're barefoot and pregnant all the time, and things like that. And, when you go somewhere else and people hear your accent, they immediately think, they always have assumptions. So I think that's another reason that Appalachian literature has that theme running through it, and in real life too. I mean,
Yeah, I will agree with assumptions being made, because I had to go to Michigan a few years back to do a school visit. And when they learned I was from Kentucky, they kind of looked at me and I said, first and foremost, I do have shoes and I'm not married to my sister. All right. And they all started laughing, but they knew that's the stereotypical of Kentucky. And then when Clay and Dreama was at the wedding, I kind of got the feeling of they're cousins, but she goes, I didn't realize you felt that way. And he's like, I didn't. And I lied. He goes, and I lied and I walked off, So it sounded like there was, and it just may not be that he was romantically in love with her, but she was his safe space, safe, been together, I don't want to say mother figure, because they looked like they were the same age, but, I think losing her was, I don't know if he realized he's losing her or not, but just, I was afraid it was kind of going towards first cousins, we're in love, but luckily I haven't gotten to, if it goes that way, I haven't gotten there yet. Hopefully it doesn't, but that was my first instinct, is the Kentucky, for people thinking Kentuckians of marrying her. And I actually do know some people that met at their family reunion and got married. So it's not totally far-fetched, but it does happen, but I'm glad it hasn't gone there yet. But that is a perceived record,
I think he wanted more for her, because that's the time that he starts talking about, you need to go to college, you need to make something of yourself. I think for me, it was that route that they were going, was he wanted more for her because he loved her.
I think that's Justin, in that same vein, I think this is another great conversation that can happen around this book with students. And it is about, and it's, I think, a theme that has emerged in the book of losing people that are important to you. Very early on, he lost his mother, and kind of, then had to go with that. He didn't have a dad. I remember in the book, he talked about, he wished that he could put a face to his dad, to the word daddy, that he didn't know that person. And then he lost his mom. And now I think he's going through that experience again of losing somebody that's really important to him. And that's a theme I think that we can have conversations with our students around, is losing people. Even when we have students who are from a more urban area who may have experienced a different kind of poverty or a different kind of family dynamic, I think we can all relate to what it means to lose somebody that's really important in your life. And this is just a different way, I thought, in the book, of him losing someone again, that was critical, a critical support person in his life. As we have just a few more minutes to go, any other themes that kind of have emerged for you all, or other areas that you want to chat about this morning? So let me tell you kind of where our plan is for moving forward. So our hope today was to kind of have some of the main themes kind of drawn out of the book, is kind of what we wanted to kind of talk about. And as we continue to get further into the book, next week we're going to cover chapters 8 through 14 in that area, or that's kind of where we hope that you all will be by then. Many of you are probably already much further along than that, but we kind of tried to chunk up the book a little bit. We're going to delve into these things a little bit more next week. So we're going to have a little more in-depth conversations around the themes of family and poverty and trauma, and how do we talk with our kids about alcohol and drug abuse within this book? What does that look like? How do we pull that theme out? We're going to talk about some of the other adult-oriented themes in the book and how we have conversations with our kids and what that could look like. And we're going to do that, I think, in some smaller groups next time, of maybe 4 or 5 people in each group, so that you can have some conversations with each other about what that looks like. We're going to talk about the music that is integrated throughout. We're going to have more conversation about that as we move through this as well, and the importance of that music. The importance of those family ties. We're going to talk about the importance of dialect. So I want you to keep, as you're reading this, keep those, the conversations that are happening in the dialect in this book, the Appalachian dialect, and what that means. We're going to have some more conversations around those things as well. So that's kind of where we hope to be today, is kind of get the big umbrella issues out. And then we're going to dig down into those a little bit deeper over the next 2 weeks. To kind of see really where we can pull that into our classes a little more. So that's kind of where we are. Any other folks have any closing thoughts before we tap out today?
Okay, it's me again, and I'm so sorry. So speaking of Berea College and Silas House, my friend from school wrote a book. Her name is Bobby Kahn. She's also from Eastern Kentucky. Moorhead, where I grew up, and she wrote a book called In the Shadow of the Valley. And it is not fluffy. Excuse me. It's not fluffy the way it doesn't paint the pretty picture that Silas paints. It paints the other side of the trauma, the alcohol, recognizing that she is poor. It's almost like, as I'm reading this, I kept going back because I read that when it first came out. And it's like, this is the good pieces of Appalachia, and hers is the not good pieces of the poverty, the alcohol use, the effects of trauma in the family. So a good comparison book, it does have some sexual references in it, but it goes along with the theme of the trauma too. So.
Thanks, Sarah. And along that same, I think Cindy next week is going to also provide us with kind of a broader list of Appalachian literature that you may want to look at as well, kind of in the context of this. But this is just, again, one book out of thousands of books, and one author out of hundreds and thousands of authors who have captured the complexity of Appalachia and of this region. And it is complex. And I think, Sarah, this kind of in the shadows, it was In the Shadow of the Valley, kind of that book, that description demonstrates the complexity. And I don't want us to lose that complexity, because, there is beauty in the trauma. There is beauty in the disruption, and there's beauty in the poverty. There's beauty in all of those things. And so it's that complex relationship between those things that I think we have to understand, and that our students are also going to be dealing with as well. And so I think that's a perfect kind of connection back to what we're looking at here. So thank you all so much for being here. It's 10:58. Thanks, David, for sharing with us what you do in your class as well, and everybody else who joined in today. We really appreciate you all. I hope that you'll join us back here next week on Thursday at 10 a.m. Eastern, 9 a.m. Central, and we'll talk in more detail about the issues that we brought out today, and kind of how we can integrate these into our classes, not just through this book, but through others that you might select as well. So thanks, everybody, for being here. Bye, everybody. See you next week.
Bye-bye. Thanks.